Ultimately, there's a reason you should get this, and a reason you shouldn't. Hi everyone, I'm Luke Hector and you're watching The Broken Meeple. This is a YouTube channel about board games where I give reviews, top 10s and my honest opinions, regardless of the consequences.
Get on with it.
This is my Beyond the Base Game series and I'm looking at the Living Forest Kodama expansion this time round. This Beyond the Base Game series is basically where I get to talk about expansions to games because I feel a lot of people don't. A lot of creators seem to bypass expansions, but expansions are important and they help to sometimes make a game even better or improve or fix a game, and I feel they need to be talked about just like anything else. Well, Living Forest, if you know it from, I think about a couple of years ago, it came out and it won the Kennerspiel Jahres, and that kind of surprised me. I mean, I'm glad it did. It's a decent game, that's why I own it, but, the Kennerspiel? I mean, it's not quite light enough to be a Spiel des Jahres, but I didn't think it was necessarily Kennerspiel worthy either, but to be honest, the definitions of how those things work is somewhat broad, we will say. But the game itself is really cool. You basically have a deck of cards full of different animal creatures, and what you do is that you do, similar to a similar game like Mystic Vale, you lay them out in order, and you're basically totaling up the symbols that appear on these cards in order to do various actions, like put out fires, or buy more cards, or plant trees. But you have symbols at the top which will make you bust if you get 3 of them in a row. They're essentially like dark symbols, solitary symbols, and so you're kind of pushing your luck to see how many things you can do without going bust, but if you bust, you basically only get to do 1 action in a turn rather than 2. The game continues on until you satisfy one of 3 victory conditions. Put out a bunch of fires, plant a bunch of trees, or get a bunch of lotus flowers. And all the different players are gunning for these different victory conditions in tandem, and so there's a little bit of tugging, push and pull, and as people sort of realise, somebody's about to finish, we need to weaken them a little bit, but then of course then they're building up, and it's got a decent amount of interaction in that respect. For the most part, you're building up your tableau of trees and cards and moving around this board and doing various things like that. Now, I enjoyed the game. The game is solid, but it did maybe need a little bit of extra meat. And also, the question of balance is always a massive point of contention with the Living Forest game. Because you've got 3 victory conditions, and there's always talk that, this one's easier than this one, and that one's easier than this one. And every time you read an article about it, it has a different viewpoint. Yeah, it generally ends up being a kind of mix of different things. And honestly, I think that the game is relatively well balanced, but there's definitely some victory conditions that are a bit easier to grasp how to go for than others. I have won with all 3, but yes, it's easier for people to understand how to win with the fire one or the tree one than it is the lotus one. But I can win with the lotus one if I gun for it, so I know what I'm doing on that regard. But of course, there has been that aspect. So what exactly does Kodama add to the mix? Well, it adds mainly 2 aspects. It firstly adds a solo mode. Now, we technically didn't have a solo mode in the previous game, but now we have a proper solo mode that has been incorporated into Living Forest, and I'll more on that later. But what it also does is it basically introduces a little sideboard with Kodama Spirits on it. So this board here will have these cards, which if you look at the artwork, besides being drop dead gorgeous, has anybody ever played the Ori games, Ori and the Will of Wisps, or Ori and the, the Tree of Legend, or Magic Tree or something? I forget what it's called. But those are 2 games that I have played and keep raving about to my friends, because in terms of platforming games, they are the most emotional, beautiful, and entertaining platform games I've ever played. The Ori games on Steam and Xbox Live are fantastic. Play it now. But I digress. These Kodama Spirits are basically an additional type of spirit that you can buy other than the sun, with the sun symbols. What it essentially is doing though is that it's utilizing the lotus flowers in more detail. So previously the lotus flowers pretty much were just victory points. That's all they did. And that's one of the reasons why people thought they were a little unbalanced, because if you gun for those early, you're not really doing a lot else. You don't get any extra bonuses for having lotus flowers. Well, now you replace a couple of bits on the main sort of circular board here with these tokens to cover a couple of actions, and you have a new action that's based off the lotus flowers. Call a Kodama. Essentially, you total up all the lotus flowers that you have on your board, and you use those as the currency to purchase these cards in much the same way as the sun action works. And these, again, give you the icons sun, water, tree, and wind and that, and more lotus flowers in terms of actually, satisfying other actions. But in addition, it gives you a Kodama symbol at the top, which essentially allows you to trigger one of several effects on the little help tile on your board. Get more fragment tiles, get these element tiles which are basically temporary boosts, or take a bonus action in the turn even if you've busted. But on top of that, you've even got a new dispenser of trees. So with this new selection here, all of these kind of key off the Kodama symbol. So if you've got 3 Kodama symbols in your row and you have this tree, then you get 3 extra water because it gives you 1 water for every Kodama symbol. 1 extra sun, 1 extra tree, 1 extra Kodama symbol period, that kind of thing. And it's a 3rd dispenser of trees. And the main little twist with these though is you might think, okay, it's just another spirit, but there is another little catch. The victory conditions are based off the spirit piles. So normally you have to get 12 of each type, like fire tokens and trees and that, in order to win the game. Well, with this expansion you now have to get 13. But in addition, if somebody exhausts one of the piles of the 3 types of Kodama spirits that there are, which are basically just different facings for the most part, then it makes the victory condition harder. So instead of 13 trees, if I exhaust this middle pile, they now have to get 15 trees. It's a way to slow down a player if they're running away with a particular victory condition, allowing you to catch up in some other regard. What basically you're getting is that the lotus flower symbol now is more balanced with the fire and the trees, because even I have to admit that it's a little weaker than the other 2. If you're going for fire, then you're getting water, which helps you with other aspects. If you're going for trees, they're getting you bonuses, which help you with other aspects. But lotus flowers by themselves, if you come for them early, you're not really getting much else. Now though, you have an extra action to do with them. Now you have a reason to collect lotus flowers early, because you can go and buy a bunch of these and make the other victory conditions harder for the opponents, giving you time to buy more cards from the sun piles in order to get more lotus flowers and carry on in that fashion. It's, I've had a pretty fun game where I'd focused entirely on wind movement and lotus flowers, and I just kept zigzagging around the board at like hyper speed while also buying out these cards, and it made for a pretty interesting way to play the game. So with the lotus flower action now being slightly beefed up, I feel that the victory conditions for water and, for the fire tokens, for the trees and the lotus flowers have now been very much better balanced than they were before. And I thought they were reasonably balanced before, but now I think it's practically watertight. You get a few extra spirits to shuffle into the main sun decks, but it's pretty minor. They mainly just give you a couple of extra abilities, like being able to do the same action twice in a turn, or giving you a bonus of a specific type of action. It's fine, shuffle them in. It doesn't even require the Kodama Spirits, frankly. You could actually shuffle them into the deck and not care about using this part of the expansion. It's not technically modular, but yeah, you can just do that. My gameplay experiences of using this particular beefed up Lotus action with my games has been really good. In fact, I would dare say that just this element alone, just this board and these cards and the new Lotus action actually is worth the price of admission alone to this expansion. It really does add a cool improvement to the game that isn't very difficult to teach on top. If you are familiar with Living Forest, you will easily get the Kodama expansion. It's like super simple rules. But I've actually taught this game with the expansion to new players, and frankly, they wouldn't necessarily even realize this was an expansion until I start putting these tokens on the board. But here's where the weak link comes in, the solo mode. Sadly, the solo mode I found to be a bit of a letdown overall. I don't believe that every game needs a solo mode. Oh, blimey, do they not all need a solo mode, especially Euro games. But I was still keen to try it, so I've given it a try. But essentially what happens is you flip this board over to the solo side, you have to get all the other players' victory point tokens on here, and essentially what happens is you have to win by the Lotus Flower victory condition. All the time though, Onibi, or whatever you want to call him, is moving around the board to where the other player positions are that don't change apart from your own, and every time it leapfrogs them, the tiles get removed from this board, and slowly but surely the fire starts ramping up in the middle. But you also have a couple of other loss conditions, like you only have 7 of these Fire Baron cards in the game, so if they all get used up, you're done. If 8 fire tokens go in the middle, you're done. And if all the victory point tiles are removed from this board, you're done. So basically, you have a shortened game timer in order to complete the Lotus Flower victory condition and then win. Now, in terms of rules, it's a very simple solo mode to use, and that is positive. It's very easy. I mean, once you get over the setup bit, which is a bit of an extra burden, more on that in a second, the rest of the rules are very straightforward, and there's only so much piloting you have to do. So that bit is really cool. Here's the 2 bits I'm not a fan of. Firstly, what do I mean by the setup? Well, The setup has everything that you see here. Now, if you know Living Forest, you know that the setup is already a bit of a pain in this game, that there's quite a lot to get on the table and sort out and separate. You gotta do that by yourself now. That hurts. I gotta do 3 dispensers and get 1 of every tree in each one. I've got to do the entire sun display. I've got to do my own board and cards. I've got to do this board here, but I've got to put all the other player stuff on there as well, and that's a pain because Living Forest doesn't have a good insert, so everything's bagged up. I use baggies to put player components separately in that, so each player can have their own starting tree, their own starting character, their own starting cards, everything in a baggie. You can't do that with the solo mode though, because the solo mode wants me to get the victory point tiles from every character, the standees for every character, and various other aspects in order to do the solo mode. So I'm constantly having to go into the other baggies and get those individual bits out just to play the solo mode, and then I got to put them back in there in the same way when this is all done in order to make it suitable for multiplayer, which I'm going to be doing this more often than not. And the other aspect I'm not a fan of is that it's very punishing. You can play this on one of 9 difficulties. You basically have a Wrath token that speeds up the Onibi spirit, and so, depending on where you put it on here, when it comes off, it makes it move faster. So depending where you stick it on here, it basically ups the difficulty of the game. Even on difficulty 3 of 9, this is a pretty difficult game to win. And it's also very one note. Firstly, this is not a long timer that it gives you. By the time it's gone around and leapfrogged a bunch of stuff, it's pretty hard. Especially when you got to keep up with the fires. And it doesn't take long before the fires are level 4s. I mean, before you know it, you've got these 4 and 3s all over the middle, and that's very difficult to put out with water, especially when the game is forcing you to go Lotus heavy. Because normally you might be thinking, well, I'm putting out fires, this is my victory condition. So fine, I've got a bunch of water, I'll put out the fires. But now you have to do that on the side. It doesn't speed up your victory condition, but you need to have some water to not take Fire of Aaron cards and not let this fire get out of control. But that's pretty tricky to do when you only have so many actions a turn, and busting in solo mode hurts. In multiplayer it's not so bad, but in solo mode, if you lose your actions, then you're in big trouble because you need like every action possible to be able to beat this thing. I feel that maybe there was just a way to make it a little bit more easygoing on the player, a little bit more lenient, but also to incorporate the other victory conditions, because one of the best aspects of Living Forest is the fact that you're juggling around the 3 different victory conditions among all the players. When you play solo, you lose that. You lose that interaction. And I don't like the idea that I'm pigeonholed into the Lotus strategy. And it's like, well, what if I want to play a solo game and play the fire strategy? I can't. It doesn't get you anything. What if I want to do the tree strategy? I can't. It doesn't get you anything. In fact, planting trees other than the Kodama trees is mostly pointless. You're just using up actions to put trees down that don't benefit you in terms of your victory condition, apart from maybe the Lotus ones. But then I'd rather get the Kodama trees because they allow you to do some very powerful turns. It's an okay solo mode, but with the long setup and that punishing nature of it, it's not one that I think I'm going to bring out on a regular basis. And if you're looking to buy this expansion purely for the solo mode, you might be a little bit disappointed. So overall, there are 2 aspects of the Kodama expansion. If I was to rate this purely on the multiplayer tweaks from the Kodama Spirits, I would give it an 8 out of 10. If I was to rate it entirely on the solo mode, I would probably only give it a 5, maybe a 6 out of 10. Overall, I'm going to balance it out and say that this is definitely worth a 7 out of 10 overall, if you are mainly getting this from the multiplayer aspect. The solo mode I just found a little bit lacking, and I don't want to have to put up with all this setup every time I want to get it out. So the solo mode is pretty much just going to sit in the back, and I'm never really going to play it again. But I do like the Kodama Spirits, and I do like the fact that I can teach them with new players. That works very well. But if you're not that fussed about playing it multiplayer, and you were hoping that this was going to be the way for you to get out to the table by yourself all the time, it's not probably going to be an expansion you're that keen on getting. And honestly, I don't think this is essential. I think the game works perfectly well in its base set form, but what it does to the Lotus action I think is so good that I think the expansion is still warranting a purchase. But you might just have to accept that the solo mode is just a little bolt-on extra, and you're really getting it for the Kodama Spirits and the Lotus action. That's pretty much the deal. 7 out of 10 overall. So that's it for me on this episode of The Broken Meeple. I'm Luke Hector, and if you like what you see, please thumb it up on YouTube to get the algorithm going, but also thumb it up on Board Game Geek when I put the video live on the Kodama expansion page. Let's get it in the hot review section. If you want to check out more content on the channel, I've done some top 10 lists for 2-player games, but I'm also currently reviewing some games from Thunderworks Games, including 10 Penny Parks and Goblin Vaults. Take care, and remember, as always, regardless of whether you want to go for fire, or for trees, or for Lotus, at the end of the day, it's still only a game. Bye for now, everyone.